everyone! Today I'm going to be working with Bezels, UV resin, and alcohol inks, and I'm just gonna get straight into today's video. The first thing I'm going to do is get my bezels on this bezel tape so I can pour my UV resin into them. I need these bezels to have a first clear layer of resin so the alcohol inks have something to hold on to when I get to that part. This video is actually inspired by a reel Let's Resin recently posted on Instagram, which after going through the comments section, I think the reel was inspired by one of Daniel Cooper's videos. I'm not exactly sure, but I just want to mention both so credit is given. I will link both the reel and Daniel's video in the description box. However, what I'm doing today is also very similar to the video I did where I dipped my resin pieces into nail polish, but instead of dipping into nail polish in water, I'm going to be dipping my bezels into UV resin and alcohol inks. So now I'm just gonna push this UV resin into the edges of these bezels and work on getting rid of the air bubbles I can already see. I am keeping this clear layer thin because later I will be adding multiple layers of more resin on these, and I don't want these bezels to get too bulky since they're pretty small already. Let me know in the comments if you enjoy making bezels. Now I'm going to give these bezels a quick heat blast from my heat gun, and that should take care of the air bubbles. Okay, so these are ready now to be put under my UV lamp, and I'm going to give them 3 minutes to start with. Just a friendly reminder that when you're working with UV resin, work with it away from any windows or direct sunlight. You don't want to risk your resin curing mid-project. Alright, this UV resin is cured up. There's no tackiness to the resin, so I can go ahead and remove these from the bezel tape. The 3 minutes was enough, so now I can get to the fun part of what I'm doing today. Another thing I'd like to mention is this is my first time using this bezel tape, and I'm impressed. The stickiness from the tape didn't transfer onto the bezels like all the other tapes I've used in the past, so if you do bezels, I'd recommend this tape. Now comes the part for the alcohol inks, and I'm going to be using Let's Resin's inks, and this part is going to be a little tricky because I'm going to have to work fast. I need to have everything ready before I get dipping, so I'm going to start by putting a thin layer of clear UV resin in the bottom of the silicone cupcake liner. You don't need much resin for this part. You only really need enough to cover the surface area of your bezels or pieces and the space to create your design with the alcohol inks. And just before we get to the alcohol inks, I'm going to quickly take this toothpick and a little bit of polymer clay to make this makeshift tool so I can use it to dip my bezels into the UV resin without making a mess. Now, the first set of colors I'm going to be trying is raspberry and emerald green, and I'm just going to put 1 drop of each onto the UV resin. Then I'm going to take another toothpick to move and swirl around the ink to create little designs and patterns like so. You do want to do it at a gentle pace so the colors don't get too muddy, but it's pretty simple. The hard part is knowing when to stop. So now that I'm happy with my design, I'm going to take my bezel, holding it from the toothpick, and dip it into the area that I like. Now, very quickly, I'm going to turn it over, level it as best as I can, and put it under my UV light. I'm going to hold it for a good 30 seconds before I go ahead and take the bezel off my toothpick and put it down. Then I'll give it a full 5 minutes under my lamp. You do want to give it a little extra time because alcohol inks can affect UV resin curing, and it can leave it sticky, especially since in this instance I just put the inks on top. For bezel number 2, I'm actually just going to redip into the same UV resin because I really like the design I've been left with here from the first dip, which is greatly appreciated. I hate wasting resin, and I do have plans for whatever resin is left over, but the downside of this is that once you put the alcohol inks in the resin, you can't take them out. I just really wanted to test and see if this technique can be done with UV resin for this part with the alcohol inks, because in the reel I saw, Let's Resin used liquid latex, and in Daniel's video, PVA glue was used, and I think it would be cool to be able to use UV resin too. For bezel number 3, I'm using aqua and emerald green, and again, I'm just going to put in 1 drop of each, though that green did sneak an extra drop in, and I'm just going to create a design. By the way, these cupcake liners are a great tool to have for resin because they're made of silicone, which means they're reusable. It's a tip I picked up from Instagram, but I wouldn't recommend it for the initial mix of your epoxy or any other 2-part resin because of all the little grooves in the edges. Unmixed resin could get stuck in the grooves and then your resin wouldn't be properly mixed, but I find these most useful when I'm working with multiple colors of resin. Now, for the last set of colors, I'm going to use raspberry and cerulean, and my hope for these 2 colors is that I'm going to get some purple as well on my bezel. I have been just sticking to 2 colors for these bezels because I don't want to overcomplicate things and increase the chance of the colors going muddy, but depending how these look, it could be worth a try adding a 3rd or 4th color to this. Another tip I have for you is when you have pigments in bottles like these, pierce the tip with a pin or a thumbtack instead of cutting them with scissors. In my experience, when I've pierced them with a pin, I find that I get more control of the drops of ink coming out, unlike some of these alcohol ink bottles which I cut the tips off with scissors. Now I'm going to give all of these another full 5 minutes under my UV lamp and we'll get to the next part. So these are ready now, and honestly, they don't look like much just yet, but that's because they need a solid color on the backs, which I'll get to in just a moment. First, I need to clean these up a little with some isopropyl alcohol because the metal parts are a bit sticky. Like I mentioned earlier, alcohol inks can leave UV resin a bit sticky, so I'm just going to take a Q-tip, spray alcohol on it, and rub the metal edges. I'll do one on camera just so you can see how I do it, but I will have to do the others as well. I'm also going to use this alcohol to remove the residue from the polymer clay that was left on the front of my pieces. And now these pieces are ready for the next layer of resin, which will be white to give us that solid color on the backs to make the designs of these bezels stand out. I am using epoxy resin for this part, and I will also be using epoxy for the top coat. In this instance, because I want a solid color, I think epoxy is the better choice. However, you can use UV resin here too, but for me, epoxy is just my go-to. It's my comfort zone, even if it means I have to wait days to complete a project. Let me know in the comments which you prefer, UV resin or epoxy resin. Now I'm going to cover these up and let this resin cure. It's partial reveal time! I'm not done with these just yet. Like I mentioned earlier, I am going to put a top coat on these so they become super shiny, but you can already see what the white backing did to these. You can really see the designs I made with the alcohol inks, and I think they look really good. Be sure to let me know which piece is your favorite. Now I'm just going to quickly put a top coat on these. Again, I'm using epoxy resin, and this top coat is just going to really elevate the colors and really finish these bezels off. Again, I'm going to cover this up and let it cure. And ta-da! What do we all think? I really love how these turned out, and I'm happy that this technique worked using UV resin. I honestly was expecting a bit of a mess, but besides the sticky sides and having to work at a faster pace, I think it was pretty easy. I hope you enjoyed this video and that you learned something. If you did, then please smash the like button, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks so much for watching.